Hey guys, tonight we will journey back in time to the reign of Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, who ascended the throne under the epithet Bloody Mary and departed in a decaying body so grotesque that history itself shuddered in silence. You will follow her path from being the Pearl of England to pursuing her dream of restoring Catholicism through the flames of heresy, witness her burning nearly 300 souls alive, and ultimately becoming a living corpse with sallow yellow skin, a distended belly, and an indescribable stench. What rendered the physicians of the Renaissance helpless before that internal fire of cancer? What medical secrets remain hidden in those ancient manuscripts? And you will not escape that horrifying nightmare. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And now, let me know where you are watching from and what the local time is for you in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the winter of 1558, the court of St. James echoed with hushed whispers of horror as they beheld the ghastly visage of Queen Mary Tudor. Once the proud daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, she now appeared with skin yellow as ancient parchment, a body so swollen that even the royal robes strained to contain it, and flesh beginning to rot, even as her last laboured breaths escaped her. This was not merely the death of a monarch, but the agonizing dissolution of a woman betrayed by her own body. Bloody Mary took her final breath at the age of 42, and even her fiercest enemies felt a pang of pity before that ravaged corpse. Her slimy flesh and putrid skin represented only the final, horrific chapter of a life steeped in suffering, betrayal, and religious fanaticism. In her last months, Mary endured a medical nightmare that even the physicians of the Renaissance, accustomed to plague, consumption, and leprosy, could only greet with dread and retreat. Modern doctors now suspect she suffered from uterine or liver cancer, a malignant tumour that turned her into a living tomb, imprisoning a mind increasingly consumed by delirium. The woman who had burned nearly 300 souls was herself consumed from within by a disease that ravaged muscle, bone, and skin. In an era when even royalty died in profound torment, Mary's end stood out for its relentless grotesqueness. The physicians could only watch in helpless horror as their queen decayed before their eyes, her regal dignity dissolving with each patch of rotting flesh. It was a cruel irony that the woman who had ordered heretics to burn now burned from an internal fire no prayers could extinguish. Mary's death would become a cautionary tale on the price of fanaticism, yet above all, it remained one of the most terrifying royal demises in English history. Compared to her contemporaries, her royal status offered no refuge from the wrath of disease. Though wielding supreme power, Mary was utterly powerless before the affliction that tortured her day after day, leaving her only authority over her own agony and decay. The crown could not mask the stench that filled the palace, nor could the throne tame the fever that racked her body. The court's whispered conversations brimmed not only with horror but with sorrow and resentment. All knew Mary's fervent dream of fully restoring Catholicism in England, her horrific burning of hundreds to prove her resolve. Yet now she lay trapped in a nightmare of her own, making an internal fire of cancer that consumed her from within. All her power and prestige were ultimately crushed by disease. Mary became both first and last in the Tudor line to discover the futility of divine authority. She begged for every sacred candle, every whispered prayer, even papal intercession, all to no avail against that merciless tumour. The chilling quiet of her death chamber stood as a harsh reminder that no matter how mighty, humanity is powerless before the destructive forces of nature. When her final breath faded, the court fell into a brief silence before the wheels of fate turned anew. Yet for a fleeting moment, Mary's image, her rotten body, nightly cries of pain, and the lingering stench of decay haunted all who witnessed it. It was a tragedy so potent that history itself recoiled at its mention, a searing lesson on the cost of fanaticism and the fragility of human flesh. And as time marched on, the tale of Bloody Mary echoed on. A crown could not save the body, faith could not mask life's cruelty, and the same flame she wielded against others ultimately consumed her in turn. Mary Tudor was born in 1516, the beloved daughter among the four legitimate heirs of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. In her youth, she lived amidst sumptuous velvet and satins, receiving meticulous instruction in languages, literature, and Catholic theology. a world of unlimited promise for a Tudor princess of both beauty and intellect. Yet overnight, everything changed. When her father fell deeply in love with Anne Boleyn, he brazenly declared his marriage to Catherine null and void, branding Mary illegitimate and stripping her of all status and privilege. This was a cataclysmic blow to Mary's identity, from the Pearl of England to an outcast in her own homeland. Her mother was exiled to remote castles, suffering isolation and illness until death, while Mary herself was forbidden to see her, deprived of royal rights, and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her half-sister Elizabeth, a young girl who, by a twist of fate, retained her crown. The humiliation and terror weighed on Mary like a crushing boulder, pressing her every breath into a state of continual dread. Henry VIII's agents were dispatched to monitor her every move, lurking in shadows, threatening beheading should she dare to assert any claim, leaving her mind in a constant state of siege. During this dark exile, Mary grew silent, withdrawn, and guarded. She suffered frequent, debilitating headaches, erratic menstrual cycles, and what modern experts would diagnose as severe depression. Her once robust physique withered under chronic stress and malnutrition. Her pallid complexion and faltering gait spoke of a soul under siege. Deprived of sunlight and companionship, Mary clung to her Catholic faith as the sole refuge, turning to prayer whenever her spirit ached. Sacred liturgies and whispered invocations became the only harbour amidst life's tempests. Physical agony compounded with emotional torment drove Mary toward absolutist convictions. She became convinced that only unchecked authority could safeguard justice and faith. She had witnessed her own father orchestrate a schism from Rome, dissolving monasteries and rejecting the papacy to satisfy personal desires. Henry's ruthless actions etched deep resentment in Mary's heart, nurturing a burning hatred for heresy and fortifying her ambition to revive Catholicism at any cost. When Henry VIII finally recognized Mary as his lawful heir in 1544, she was no longer the untouched princess of yesteryear. The psychological scars and prolonged mental torture had transformed her into a woman consumed by bitterness, willing to do whatever it took to reclaim her rightful position and restore the Church. That pivotal moment served as the lightning rod for the violent reign to come, a reign that would forever brand her Bloody Mary, while engraving a personal tragedy of unimaginable scope in the annals of history, an ordeal that sprang from the very man who once held her future in his hands. Mary ascended the throne in 1553, inheriting a realm still quivering from Lady Jane Grey's brief flash of power. At 37 years old, considered advanced for childbirth by Tudor standards, Mary felt an urgent drive. She yearned for a son to secure the Catholic restoration she'd embraced since childhood. Imagine her standing before the glittering court, crown heavy on her brow, heart pounding with both hope and anxiety, ready to clutch at any sign of life sustaining her vision. Not long after her coronation, Mary wed Philip II of Spain. The ceremony, a display of statecraft rather than romance, filled Westminster with Spanish banners and whispered prayers for political solidarity. Yet Philip's eyes seemed to wander beyond the assembled nobles, and his touch was courteous but distant. In that gilded hall, Mary felt surprisingly alone, clutching polite offers of comfort, while her heart clung to dreams of motherhood that felt forever out of reach. Within mere months, Mary publicly declared her pregnancy, a declaration that ignited a collective hysteria. Catholic lords transformed prayer breakfasts into royal rituals. Noble women draped themselves in symbols of maternity, and the royal midwife was consulted daily on when the Queen's maternity cloak would be replaced with a new gown. Even seasoned Renaissance physicians, veterans of plague and pox, went silent upon approaching her chambers, tiptoeing around facts in the face of her hopeful gaze. Yet month after month passed, and the hush of midnight prayers replaced any newborn's cry. Mary spent nights reciting the 52 Psalms, her candle flame flickering against tear-streaked cheeks as she begged for a sign from the Eucharist. Outside, foreign envoys scribbled cautious reports. "The Queen's condition remains unchanged," they wrote, hinting at a growing courtly skepticism about a pregnancy that might never be. Then came 2 phantom pregnancies. At first, Mary confidently hailed every ache and flutter as proof, determined to soothe her court's fervent expectations. But as the months dragged on, the strain showed. On one silent night, courtiers heard her rage, filled sobs echo through the corridors, her impassioned pleas turning to anguished screams that left even the guards rattled. She smashed candlesticks, sent her ladies-in-waiting fleeing, and cursed her own body for betraying her faith. Desperate, Mary blamed Protestants, the enemies of God, for withholding divine grace. Her resentment morphed into a reign of terror. From 1555 to 1558, over 280 souls, men, women, and even children were burned at the stake in public spectacles. Mary personally oversaw every detail, ordering sermons before the flames, selecting aromatic wood to prolong the agony, and inspecting each condemned person to ensure their final moments would serve as a stern warning against heresy. She even smiled as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer leaned into the fire, a chilling testament to her ruthless devotion. Yet the strategy spectacularly backfired. Those who perished became martyrs in the eyes of the populace, their unwavering courage fanning the flames of Protestant resistance across England. Rumours spread that their souls, freed from earthly bonds, roamed Geneva and Frankfurt, inspiring hardscrabble refugees into doctrinal defiance. Mary's fury intensified in return. Convinced that fire was the only path to salvation, she clung to this doctrine more fiercely than any personal longing for a child. The blend of psychological despair, bodily betrayal, and religious fanaticism forged a horrifying reality within Mary herself. The once hopeful princess had become a living nightmare, dispensing divine justice with a torch in hand, her heart hardened by the very faith she sought to revive. Courtiers whispered that her eyes gleamed like embers when she spoke of the purgation necessary to cleanse England's soul. In the cold halls of her palaces, Mary's figure, regal yet haunted, remains an enduring image of power, unmoored from compassion. The Bloody Mary era closed not only with the crackle of flames, but with the echo of a queen who ignited her own humanity in the inferno she raised. Her story stands as a grim reminder that unchecked authority, fueled by fanaticism, can consume both the persecuted and the persecutor, leaving behind only embers of tragedy and the smouldering ruins of empathy. At the same time Mary was intensifying her religious persecution, her own body began to send ominous warnings of an impending medical catastrophe. Initially, it was merely a mild abdominal distension, what we now might recognize as an ovarian or uterine tumor. But within weeks, the Queen's stomach ballooned in unnatural proportions. The once graceful movements that defined her regal bearing turned into slow, agonizing shifts, each motion feeling as though her organs were being torn apart. 16th century medicine had no concept of cancer. Physicians resorted to the crudest of therapies: bloodletting with lancets, harsh herbal purges, and concoctions brewed from plants without regard for dosage or toxicity. These treatments did nothing to arrest Mary's condition. Instead, they left her gaunt, severely dehydrated, and pale as if drained of life itself. Chroniclers noted in hushed tones that she looked more like a spectre than a sovereign during their visits. As her illness advanced, jaundice set in. Mary's skin took on a sickly yellow-grey hue akin to that of the recently deceased, prompting even courtiers to recoil at the sight of her. The swelling of her abdomen reached extremes that no royal gown could accommodate, forcing her to be seated on a specially constructed high-backed chair, draped in velvet pillows to alleviate pressure. Throughout St. James's Palace, whispers of her nocturnal groans echoed, sending shivers through the guards who kept vigil. The interplay of physical agony and psychological torment bred an unhealthy paranoia within Mary. She came to suspect everyone around her: friends, ladies-in-waiting, and even members of her own council of poisoning or witchcraft. Loyal servants endured the humiliation of tasting her food first to prove it safe, only to watch as the Queen, starved of nourishment and drowning in fear, often vomited everything she attempted to swallow. Her digestive system rebelled, alternating painfully between constipation and violent diarrhea, leaving her too weak even to maintain a regal posture at her bedside. The pungent odours of rot permeated her chambers, forcing perfumers to burn incense so heavily that the very air grew thick and oppressive. By then, Mary's ability to chew and swallow had dwindled. Even the blandest broth would trigger nausea, and medicinal potions, bitter in the best of times, now became insults to her failing constitution. This relentless decline brought the machinery of government to a near standstill. Ministers, too terrified by the Queen's volatile condition and lingering stench, avoided the royal audience chamber whenever possible. Foreign envoys, accustomed to face-to-face negotiations, resorted to delivering missives via secretaries or participating in elaborate ceremonial exchanges of parchment rather than formal council meetings. Yet Mary herself persisted in ruling from her deathbed. She issued orders for the arrest and execution of heretics to the very end, demonstrating that even in decay her fanaticism had not dimmed. Mary's body and spirit, once instruments of divine justice, now seemed set on mutual destruction. Physically, she deteriorated visibly. Her flesh rotted away in patches, leaving depressions and ulcers that refused to heal. Yet her conviction only intensified. She equated her suffering with divine trial, interpreting each bout of agony as a test of faith. The same hands that had summoned fire to purge heretics now lay idle on the armrests of her deathbed, powerless to quell the inner inferno burning her flesh from within. In these harrowing final days, Mary stood as both victim and executioner. Her disease ravaged her from the inside, yet her decrees unleashed external flames by fiat. She was trapped in a macabre dance of mortality, in which she wielded the power to destroy others, while her own body collapsed in silent rebellion. The contrast between the decaying flesh that lay beneath her royal vestments and the unextinguished flame of her fanaticism offered a stark image. The ultimate price of unchecked authority and the cruelty it can exact upon both the ruled and the ruler. For posterity, Mary's final chapter remains a chilling lesson. No matter how mighty, human power cannot triumph over nature's ruthless forces. A crown may impose earthly dominion, but it cannot shield against the slow, inexorable advance of disease. In choosing fire as her instrument of salvation for others, Mary had also ignited a conflagration within herself, one that consumed her from the inside out, leaving behind ashes of both spirit and flesh. In her final weeks, Mary existed like a dying soul. Her bedchamber became a horrific medical scene. Necrotic patches spread across her frame, wounds oozed rank pus, and her fingers and toes turned black and cracked. Every time a physician applied a lancet or strong herbal remedy, the infection worsened, compounding her agony manifold. She was forced to sit upright. Any attempt to lie down caused blood and bodily fluids to pool painfully, making her gasp as though strangled. Her mind oscillated between religious ecstasy, believing suffering to be God's trial, and demonic panic, convinced that devils lurked to tear her apart. She demanded constant masses, clinging to the belief that the Eucharist could redeem her rotting flesh. Yet even loyal clergy had to stifle their revulsion at the tragic sight. Sweat dampened holy cloths, prayer books dropping into pools of yellow fluid. By early November, Mary's condition was beyond saving. Her internal organs failed in turn, and each raspy breath sounded like a death knell. When she lifted her head from the pillows, servants trembled at the sight, as though they heard the final chime of fate. On the morning of the 17th of November, sunlight filtered through the wooden shutters, and Mary exhaled her last breath in sudden silence. No final words, just the fading echo of a moan. Her corpse, still riddled with decay, was prepared for burial in grim secrecy, parts mummified, others liquefied, and the stench so overwhelming that palace staff donned protective clothing. The heavy incense meant to mask the odor only thickened the air, forcing caretakers to open windows for days. Clothing and furnishings, irretrievably tainted, were destroyed to avoid haunting the living. The funeral on the 14th of December at Westminster Abbey was marked by oppressive stillness. Mourners attended out of duty more than devotion. Genuine grief seemed to hide behind hurried bows. There were no triumphant trumpets, only the subdued lament of those escorting her remains. Almost immediately, Elizabeth I ascended the throne and halted all religious persecutions. Exiled Protestants returned enthusiastically, bearing capital and ideas that revitalized England's economy within months. London's markets buzzed once more. Bristol's docks teemed with trade that had stagnated under Mary's reign. Bloody Mary's legacy became a cautionary tale about religious fanaticism. The Church, tarnished by cruelty, compassion replaced by violence, and a royal body once the pinnacle of authority ravaged by decay. The stench of her rotting flesh and the soft moans of her final agony forever imprinted on England's collective memory, a stark reminder of the price of unchecked power. Almost the moment Mary Tudor's life slipped away, Europe convulsed with both chaos and relief, and this shockwave rippled even through the most fervently Catholic courts. Imagine the bishops of Spain's grand cathedrals, the electors of the Holy Roman Empire, and even Emperor Charles himself, gathered in candlelit halls, exchanging nervous glances. Many feared Mary's ruthless program of persecution had sullied the prestige of the Roman Church far beyond redemption. Word reached Pope Paul V, who found himself in the unspoken position of damage control. He dispatched private letters, urging Mary's counsellors to impose moderation for the common welfare, yet he dared not publicly rebuke the late Queen whose fires had already consumed countless souls. Meanwhile, in treaty rooms across Western Europe, English envoys sent urgent missives to huddled groups of Protestant exiles. Over the past 3 years, these pilgrims of faith had scattered to safe havens: Geneva's austere council chambers, Frankfurt's bustling market squares, and Strasbourg's grand universities. Each city brimmed with refugees carrying not only stories of martyrdom, but also financial savings, artisanal skills, and trade connections accumulated before their flight. At the mere hint of Mary's demise, these networks sprang into motion. Letters sealed with the ESR cipher for Elizabeth Regina instructed prominent exiles to prepare for a return journey. The sense of anticipation crackled through the air like candle sparks in a draughty church. Back in London, couriers galloped across muddy roads to deliver the news. The Queen is dead. Long live the Queen. Elizabeth's accession proclamation went out by the stroke of midnight, and as dawn broke, the city's skyline buzzed with the return of Protestant merchants, each step echoing with the clatter of wagon wheels laden with textiles, grain, and precious metals. Master weavers from Norwich reassembled their looms, Dutch-trained potters dusted off their kilns, and Cornish fishers prepared nets for the North Sea's morning catch. Within weeks, the capital's cobblestone streets thronged with foreign tongues, Dutch, French, and German, signalling a revival of commerce that had slumbered under the shadow of fear. Yet the path to restoration was not without thorny obstacles. During Mary's reign between 1555 and 1558, hundreds of Catholic estates had been confiscated, their lands parcelled out to loyalists or swallowed by the Crown's holdings. Under Elizabeth's rule, the Privy Council faced a diplomatic minefield: how to restitute properties and titles to families now deemed politically suspect. The solution, crafted in candlelit debates, was a careful compensation scheme. Some noble families were granted newly surveyed lands elsewhere. Others received bonds redeemable for future tax relief. The result was a delicate balance, returning confiscated estates while preserving sufficient revenue streams to fund the burgeoning navy. Elizabeth inherited a navy soon destined to confront the Spanish Armada. On the economic front, the benefits of the exiles' return were nothing short of transformative. Magistrates in port cities reported surges in customs revenues, as English ships once again plied routes to Antwerp, Lisbon, and Livorno. The Scottish trade delegation, abruptly authorised by London, began bartering woolens for Baltic timber and Russian furs. In Devon, merchants reopened direct lines with the Azores, shipping salted fish and salt back to Lisbon, recreating commercial arteries severed by Mary's alliance with Spain. Even inland towns such as Gloucester and Berry Street, Edmonds saw their weekly markets double in attendance, with English wares fetching premium prices on the continent, while continental goods reappeared in local shop windows. Culturally, this influx of returning exiles accelerated the flow of ideas as well as goods. Publishers in London reprinted radical theological tracts smuggled out during Mary's persecution, while academic circles in Cambridge and Oxford revived lectures on Reformation principles once silenced by papal edicts. Young scholars, fluent in French and German, introduced new treatises on republican governance, foreshadowing political dialogues that would unfold over the next century. Even Elizabeth herself, renowned for her linguistic prowess, received weekly briefings in Latin, Italian, and Spanish, reflecting her shrewd combination of cultural patronage and diplomatic vigilance. Yet amid this heady revival, the scars of Mary's reign remained fresh. Streets of London still bore plaques marking execution sites where Marian martyrs had been burned. Families spoke in hushed tones of ancestors whose ashes had been scattered across the Thames. Rivers that now carried merchant galleys teeming with cargo. Protestant preachers, delivering sermons in street, Paul's Cathedral, invoked these martyrs as symbols of resilience. "Their courage lights our path," they preached, urging congregations to cherish a faith that could survive fire and tyranny. Within the corridors of power, Elizabeth balanced magnanimity with prudence. She extended titles to moderate Catholic nobles willing to pledge loyalty, integrating them into a reformed Church of England. This calculated gesture diffused potential rebellions, yet retained the crown's supremacy over church property and doctrine. Parliament, convening in early 1659, passed the Act of Supremacy, reaffirming her position as supreme governor of the Church, a legal bulwark against foreign, red papal, intervention. By the end of Elizabeth's first year, England's transformation was unmistakable. The rattle of trade chests replaced the hush of fear. The clang of shipyards echoed louder than church bells' tolling bands. Protestant exiles turned financiers invested in new colonial ventures, dispatching ships to North America in search of timber and fur, thereby laying the groundwork for England's future maritime empire. In Lyon and Geneva, merchants marvelled at English cloth, now rivaling Flemish brands in quality, sold at competitive prices, invigorating local economies across Europe. Thus, Mary Tudor's passing catalyzed a dramatic reversal. A realm once paralyzed by religious terror and economic stagnation rebounded with vigor. The Protestant return welded together disparate trading networks, cultural exchanges surged across borders, and Elizabeth's deft policies of reconciliation and reform stitched Britain's social fabric back together. The economics minister, in a now famous dispatch to the Crown, summarized the turnaround. "Madam, the coffers once dry now overflow, and the people's hearts are lighter than feathers caught on the sea breeze." In the end, Mary's tragic legacy, a kingdom rent asunder by fire and fear, served as a stark lesson. Under Elizabeth's steady hand, England emerged from the crucible of persecution not only stronger, but more outward-looking, a nation ready to embrace religious moderation, commercial innovation, and the promise of a maritime future. The age of Bloody Mary faded into memory, replaced by an Elizabethan Renaissance that would illuminate the world with English literature, science, and naval prowess. Militarily and diplomatically, Mary suffered a crushing defeat by France at Calais, the final stain on England's continental legacy. Calais was far more than a mere stronghold. It was the symbolic heartbeat of English power on the continent. Seized by Edward III in the 14th century, this lone slice of mainland territory had stood firm against countless foes. Yet in 1558, while Mary lay dying, Calais fell into French hands. News of its loss struck London like thunder on a clear day. Mary's court trembled as commanders and courtiers alike stared at each other in stunned disbelief. Picture the scene. Barons and captains hastily convened at Whitehall in an emergency council, their grand chambers still echoing the clang of ceremonial swords but heavy with dread. English galleons, once the terror of the Channel, sat idle in harbour, their sails furled, cannons cold and silent. The massive guns atop Calais' ramparts hailed by soldiers, as the invincible bulwark now lay mute, overshadowed by French artillery. The fall of Calais stripped Mary not only of a fortress, but of England's extended arm abroad, signalling an abrupt shift from continental ambition to insular concern. Symbolically, Mary had prided herself as the hammer that crushed heretics, yet that very image shattered at Calais. Meanwhile, those she had burned, Thomas Cranmer, Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer, and over 280 Marian martyrs, were never forgotten. To the English people, these steadfast souls became living legends, canonized in memory. As news of Calais' fall spread, tales of Marian martyrdom swept across Europe, fanning the flames of staunch anti-Catholic sentiment. During Elizabeth's reign, commemorations of the martyrs became woven into the fabric of Protestant identity. Congregations donned white robes, clutching candles as they honoured those who faced the stake with unyielding faith. Londoners gathered by the Thames at a modest shrine, laying wreaths in silent tribute, martyrs no longer condemned, but hailed as national heroes. This reverence crystallized a collective resolve. No tyranny, no matter how absolute, could quell the spirit of a faithful people. The legend of the Marian martyrs even resonated abroad. Envoys from Zurich carried accounts to Geneva, where annual memorial services became fixtures in the city's religious calendar. In Basel, pastors invoked their stories to teach the principles of religious freedom, while along the Rhine, townsfolk recounted Ridley and Latimer's final speeches as folklore, highlighting the might of conviction over flame. Back in London, weekly sermons packed with worshippers overflowed with references to the blood of the saints, metaphorically weaving resistance into the very tapestry of English Protestantism. Thus, the juxtaposition of Calais' military collapse and the enduring legacy of the Marian martyrs turned Mary's crowning ambition into a profound tragedy. She, who had once wielded absolute authority, witnessed her continental foothold vanish and her dying body succumb to agony. The defeat at Calais and the martyrdom of hundreds were immortalized in chronicles and ballads, passed from generation to generation as cautionary tales. Yet they also served as rallying cries, forging a national character defined by steadfastness and a vigilant embrace of freedom. In the end, Mary Tudor's legacy, marked by both fiery persecution and final defeat, became a cornerstone of the Elizabethan Renaissance. England emerged with renewed purpose. An island nation confident in its identity, wary of religious zealotry, and proud of its resilient soul. The echo of Calais' cannons and the whispered prayers of the Marian martyrs fortsat to shape England's path, reminding all who heard that true strength lies not in conquest, but in the unwavering courage of the human spirit. On the diplomatic front, the Dawn alliance between England and Spain under Queen Mary abruptly dissolved in the wake of her demise. When Mary died, Philip II did not even set foot in London to mourn. Instead, he dispatched envoys to negotiate with Queen Elizabeth, ensuring Spain's interests in England were preserved. The image of a grieving queen without her emperor beside her rattled the English court. "So much for marital devotion, only diplomatic pacts remain," whispered the nobles. England's commercial and military reliance on Spain unravelled swiftly. Mary had believed her marriage to Philip would serve as an unassailable political lifeline. Yet Elizabeth, with calm calculation, rejected that marital alliance the moment she ascended. She recognized that England should not place all its hopes on Spain, especially as Spain's resources were stretched thin, fighting in the Low Countries. Instead, Elizabeth pivoted toward new alliances in Northern Europe and the nascent Dutch Republic. She extended diplomatic overtures to the King of Denmark and the Queen of Norway, proposing robust trade partnerships, while quietly forging secret agreements with the Dutch for naval intelligence sharing. The Dutch, with their swift merchant vessels and adept seafarers, proved the perfect partners to bolster the Royal Navy's coastal defences and protect England's busy ports. The Royal Navy, long neglected by Mary in favour of domestic repression, suddenly received a flood of resources. Coastal fortifications were reinforced overnight. New sailors were recruited from the ports of Yorkshire and the Isle of Man, and the call to service reverberated through Portsmouth and Plymouth. Ships that had lain rotting in the harbours were refitted, their gun decks cleared and their hulls caulked. England's maritime posture, once hesitant, was reborn into an outward-facing strategy, securing sea lanes rather than cowering at the Channel's expanse. Within the court itself, many officials and nobles of Catholic background publicly declared their allegiance to Elizabeth. Figures such as the Earl of Nottingham and the Archbishop of Canterbury issued statements of neutrality or even sporadic participation in the Reformed Church to retain their lands and titles. This transition unfolded more smoothly than anticipated. Within a matter of weeks, dozens of familiar faces quietly signed oaths of loyalty. Yet the old wounds of allegiance and distrust did not vanish. They lingered in wary glances, exchanged in corridor meetings and subdued conversations behind ornate chamber doors. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church in England retreated into a covert existence. A network of secret priests and lay supporters sprang back to life, conducting clandestine services in hidden cellars and private manor libraries. They devised subtle signals, a scarlet rose pinned to a lapel, a particular page of scripture left in view to identify sympathetic households. When a safe house was compromised, the network simply shifted locations, ensuring that Catholic worship endured in the shadows until a more favourable moment. Across Europe, Elizabeth's diplomatic recalibrations did not go unnoticed. Envoys from Sweden and Norway praised England's shift toward Baltic cooperation, noting the promise of shared timber, fish, and naval intelligence. A Dutch ambassador, in a letter to the States General, lauded England's maritime renaissance, forecasting joint ventures in whaling and Baltic grain imports. In Paris and Madrid, officials bristled at England's departure from its Spanish marriage alliance. France swiftly proposed a short-term trade accord with London, even as it covertly encouraged English Catholics to temper their underground activities to avoid destabilizing Europe. Spain, simmering with guarded resentment, paused its naval funding in the North Sea, forcing Philip to navigate the delicate balance between continental ambitions and his need to appease the new English monarch. All of these shifts placed Elizabeth at the helm of a transformed England, no longer wed to a single powerful ally, but enmeshed in a web of partnerships across Northern Europe and the Dutch Republic. England became a linchpin in maritime commerce, linking Norwegian timber, Danish herring, and Dutch textiles through its own ports and ships. These ties laid the foundation for an economy and navy robust enough to defend against any foe, and agile enough to seize opportunities on the high seas. In retrospect, this period marks a dramatic turning point. Mary had banked on religious zeal and dynastic marriage. Elizabeth bet on diplomatic savvy and diversified ties. She did not need to marry for power, she wielded her own reputation and a global strategy. By doing so, England evolved from an inward struggling kingdom sharing Protestant strife and mourning, lost Calais, into a confident maritime force, ready to tackle challenges both at sea and on the world stage. In the end, Elizabeth's deft diplomacy outshone Mary's singular alliances. Where Mary had narrowly tethered herself to one crown, Elizabeth spread her nets wide, forging alliances that enriched commerce, strengthened naval defences, and secured England's place among Europe's great powers. Thus concluded the transition from Mary's doomed solidarity with Spain to Elizabeth's bold engagement with the wider northern world, a strategic shift that would define England's rise as a leading maritime nation. Almost immediately after Elizabeth I's accession, she moved swiftly to repeal Mary's oppressive anti-heresy statutes and restore the Church of England. The proclamation, "God Save the Queen," echoed through the city as England welcomed back its national faith. Within weeks, Elizabeth enacted the Act of Uniformity 1559, setting out a singular liturgy and prayer book to be used across all English parishes. This was more than mere legislation, it was a unifying beacon, drawing a line under the 3 years of Marian terror and marking the dawn of the Elizabethan Golden Age. Simultaneously, exiled clergy, those who had fled to Geneva, Frankfurt, or Strasbourg, received royal pardons to return home. Their ships landed to cheers. "Welcome back, ministers of the faith." The Marian courts, once executing alleged heretics in broad daylight, were swiftly dismantled. In a dramatic ritual at the Palace of Westminster, a proclamation abolishing heresy trials was posted at the door of St. Margaret's Church, symbolizing the end of state-sponsored persecution and the start of a new chapter. Confiscated lands and properties were gradually restored to victims or their descendants. Castles once converted into armories now reopened as family seats. Fields left fallow were tilled anew. Couriers bearing red-sealed letters travelled south to Cornwall and north to Yorkshire, delivering restitution orders to grateful gentry and yeomen alike. Within months, estates long abandoned sprang back to life. Sheep grazed on reclaimed pastures, and manor houses reverberated with laughter once more. This rapid religious turnaround officially closed the bloody chapter of Marian repression. From Canterbury Cathedral to street pauls in London, the chorus of hymns replaced the lonely toll of penance bells. Sunday services overflowed with congregations eager to worship freely, while the common prayer book became the spiritual thread weaving together north and south, aristocrat and commoner alike. The Church of England's renewed rituals offered solace and stability, wood and stone no longer haunted by the spectre of fire. Elizabeth's policy of religious moderation proved masterful. She upheld Anglicanism as the state faith but extended clemency to moderate Catholics. Bishops and nobles who pledged loyalty retained their lands, while Catholic priests who conformed to the new order could continue ministering in their parishes. This approach avoided the excesses of Bloody Mary. Elizabeth's restraint ensured the Crown maintained authority without reigniting civil unrest. Although minor disturbances occurred, an illicit Catholic Mass here, a fervent Presbyterian pamphlet there, the majority welcomed the newfound tolerance. Royal commissioners quietly dispersed unsanctioned gatherings, issuing warnings rather than arrests. The people soon recognized that religious peace was worth a little concession, and the kingdom stabilized under Elizabeth's balanced hand. Under her reign, English culture blossomed as never before. In London's playhouses, Shakespeare's works premiered to thunderous applause. From Romeo and Juliet to Twelfth Night, audiences packed the Globe Theatre to explore themes of love, power, and redemption, mirroring their own national rebirth. Attendance soared threefold compared to Mary's era, as citizens celebrated their liberation with each dramatic line. Beyond the stage, voyages to the New World accelerated. The East India Company, flourishing under royal charters, outfitted ships bound for Virginia and the Caribbean. Pilots and captains charted courses through uncharted waters, returning with tales of untamed landscapes and opportunities for settlements. Cambridge printers published maps depicting Chesapeake Bay and Newfoundland, sparking excitement among patrons eager to invest in overseas expeditions. In parallel, domestic coastal trade thrived. Merchant vessels laden with wool, coal, and farm produce chugged up and down the Thames, linking London to Midlands markets and eastern ports. Customs revenues soared as tariffs funded modernisation of docks and fleets. From Hull to Bristol, the roar of commerce filled every quay, signalling an England reborn. All these vibrant developments trace their roots back to Mary's symbolic downfall. Her death tested the limits of monarchical power, while Elizabeth's deft statesmanship charted a new course. The legacy of Marian terror endured as a solemn warning. Elizabeth's pragmatic clemency became a beacon of hope. It is this very contrast that enabled Tudor England not only to survive, but to thrive, heralding an era of artistic brilliance, scientific discovery, and maritime ascendancy. Thus, the reign of Elizabeth I stands as a testament to the power of moderation over fanaticism. By restoring religious harmony, encouraging cultural innovation, and promoting exploration, she guided England into a golden age. The 3 years of terror faded into memory, replaced by the promise of unity and progress. And so, the Tudor dynasty's final chapter became one of triumph and transformation, echoing through the centuries as a model of enlightened rule. The enduring legacy of Mary Tudor, forever known as Bloody Mary, is seared into England's collective memory as an unambiguous warning about the perils of religious zealotry and the brutality of unchecked authority. Even centuries later, her name evokes not just the flames she set under alleged heretics, but the darker horror of her own final days, an agonizing death by what modern scholars believe was ovarian or liver cancer, her flesh rotting while she yet lived. This ghastly fate gave rise to the chilling legend of the internal fire, a metaphor for her transformation from persecutor to victim of a merciless disease. In the annals of history, Mary stands as a cautionary figure. Even a crown has no power against mortality, and fanaticism can devour both one's principles and one's body from the inside out. From a medical standpoint, the archival records of Mary's afflictions remain unparalleled in Tudor England. Court physicians meticulously documented her progressive abdominal swelling, likely an ovarian mass, her severe jaundice turning her skin a sallow yellow-grey, and the necrotic lesions that oozed in foul-smelling discharge. Their journals recount repeated bloodletting sessions, purgative herbal brews, and primitive cauterizations, all intended to balance humours, yet only hastening her wasting away. Though cancer would not be properly understood until centuries later, these Tudor-era case notes have provided invaluable data for retrospective oncological study. 19th and 20th century researchers, poring over these first-hand accounts, glean early clinical descriptions of malignant ascites, hepatic failure, and tissue necrosis, details that bridge the gap between pre-modern treatments and modern cancer pathology. Historians and psychologists alike find Mary's life a deeply complex subject. On one hand, she was an innocent child, once adored daughter of Henry VIII, and Catherine of Aragon, branded illegitimate when her father remarried, forced into exile, and subjected to relentless psychological torment. On the other, she became a merciless ruler who ordered the burning of over 280 men, women, and children in her fervent mission to restore Catholicism. Recent scholarly works have attempted to reconcile these contrasting facets by exploring how childhood trauma, chronic stress, and perceived betrayal can morph into an uncompromising desire for absolute control. In psychological terms, Mary embodies the tragic irony of a victim-turned-tyrant. Her early wounds fueled a pathological need for doctrinal purity, unleashing violence that would ultimately circle back to destroy her. Even sympathetic biographies admit the final, harrowing outcome was inevitable. Mary's relentless persecutions, intended to secure her legacy as England's Catholic saviour, instead immortalized her as a symbol of cruelty. Simultaneously, her excruciating demise underscored a universal truth. Human power, no matter how exalted, cannot defy the natural order. In the words of 20th century historian Dr. Patricia Ermengarde, Mary Tudor's reign and ruin remain the clearest admonition that fanaticism, when fused with sovereignty, yields ruin both for the ruler and the realm. In cultural memory, Bloody Mary thrives in both high and low art. Shakespearean plays subtly reference the dangers of religious extremism, while Victorian novels dramatize her as a cautionary spectre. In contemporary folklore, the mirror game Bloody Mary, chant her name 3 times in the glass, plays upon the enduring fascination with her ghostly visage, jaundiced skin, hollow eyes, ravenous wounds, and the haunted echo of her anguished scream. These popular iterations may lack historical accuracy, yet they attest to her lasting imprint on the collective imagination. She is a monarch who literally burned herself in history's judgment. From a medical historical perspective, Dr. Simon Fairfax of the London Medical Institute has noted, "The Tudor clinicians' handwritten notes on Mary's symptoms provide a rare window into pre-modern oncology. Their observations have enabled us to trace the natural history of intra-abdominal malignancies centuries before spectroscopy or histology existed." Thus, Mary's ordeal has transcended political narrative to inform the development of pathological research, reminding physicians of the continuities between ancient humoral theory and modern cancer science. When touring Westminster Abbey today, one might pause by the silent cloisters and recall that beneath these stones rest both saints and sinners. Outside, in Calais, the empty ramparts echo with the memory of England's last continental stronghold, lost while Mary lay dying. Pilgrims linger at stained-glass windows depicting the Marian martyrs Thomas Cranmer, Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer, their steady faith in flames now honoured as foundational to Anglican identity. Each stained panel, each marble tomb, enshrines the complex legacy of Mary, both persecutor and martyr, woman and monarch, zealot and sufferer. Theologians debate her soul's fate, but all agree her story resonates as a timeless lesson. Elizabeth I, Mary's half-sister, spent her reign erasing the scars of Marian repression through measured tolerance. Yet Mary's spectre remained, a reminder of the extremes toward which religious conviction can lead. In curious contrast, Elizabeth's own precarious hold on power hinged on prudence and moderation qualities, forged in the crucible of her sister's reign. On stormy nights, when the wind howls around the Tudor chapels, one can almost hear Mary's final moans mingling with the chants of long-ago intercessions. The candlelit arches seem to whisper, "Be wary of devotion untempered by mercy. Be mindful that mortal flesh can only endure so much without compassion, and remember that the highest throne offers no immunity from human frailty." Thus, the legacy of Bloody Mary endures as both historical fact and moral parable. It challenges each generation to reflect on the perils of conflating divine command with autocratic power, and the fragility of life, even for those who wear crowns. In the end, Mary Tudor's life and death stand as a singular testament to how the fires one kindles in the world may nonetheless consume one's own spirit and body, a lesson as vital now as it was in the 16th century. After Mary Tudor's funeral, England hung suspended between relief and residual fear, the air thick with both political intrigue and religious tension. In the swirling aftermath of 3 years of Marian terror, Elizabeth I moved with quiet determination to shore up her base of support among the Anglican faithful. Within weeks of her coronation, she convened a council of prominent nobles and bishops, many of whom had suffered under Mary's burnings, to draft the Act of Uniformity of 1559. This landmark legislation mandated a uniform form of worship across the realm, complete with a newly printed Book of Common Prayer that prescribed every liturgical gesture, from the sign of the cross to the tone of the minister's blessing. For the average parishioner, this meant that attending church was no longer a gamble with their life. It was a predictable, structured ritual that replaced the capricious fury of Marian persecutions with measured stability. Suddenly, church attendance felt safe, and that safety became the bedrock of Elizabeth's early reign. Yet Elizabeth's vision extended beyond the walls of every Anglican parish. She recognized that a firm line between us and them risked reopening the wounds Mary had so thoughtlessly torn. Thus, she adopted a policy of measured tolerance toward moderate Catholics, a group she referred to wryly as the twice-behaved faithful. These nobles and clerics, many of whom had once served in Mary's government, or retained secret attachments to Rome, were permitted to keep their lands and titles, provided they pledged loyalty to the crown. In practice, this meant that they had the choice to attend Anglican services on Sundays and quietly celebrate Catholic Mass in private homes on weekdays. Elizabeth understood the delicate balance: allow enough freedom to keep moderate Catholics from rebelling, yet assert enough authority to prevent a full-scale Catholic resurgence. To the Pope, this stance must have looked like a diplomatic slight. To her subjects, it felt like an olive branch. By granting this limited latitude, Elizabeth diffused the potential for violent backlash and laid the groundwork for a new era of religious coexistence. Of course, tolerance did not equal passivity. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth faced plots hatched by Catholic extremists, both domestic and foreign, who viewed her religious settlement as a betrayal of Rome. Agents of the papal nuncio conspired to place a Catholic monarch on the English throne. At home, underground priests risked capture to minister to the faithful in secret chapels. On occasion, Elizabeth dispatched trusted bishops to interrogate suspected priests and suppress illicit gatherings, but these actions were measured and contained. Comparisons to Mary's broad edicts of execution would have been laughable. The occasional arrest was followed by a warning or a fine, rarely by imprisonment for life. This restrained approach served two purposes. It reassured moderate Protestants that the realm's religious future was secure, and it prevented Catholic hardliners from martyring gentle souls en masse, which could have spurred broader rebellion. Elizabeth's limited strategic enforcement thus protected her kingdom from both sectarian bloodshed and the political chaos that accompanies it. The cultural effects of this religious equilibrium were nothing short of explosive. Under the relative calm of Elizabeth's settlement, England experienced a renaissance in arts and commerce. Playwrights like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe found thriving audiences for their dramas, which often explored themes of ambition, betrayal, and repentance, an unspoken nod to the recent upheavals. Public theatres in London and the provinces swelled with eager patrons, the roar of the Globe crowd a world away from the ominous crackle of Marian pyres. Meanwhile, English ships launched ambitious voyages. Privateers tested their cannons on Spanish galleons, and the East India Company dispatched its first fleets to the Indian Ocean. Merchants traded spices, silks, and porcelain with newfound confidence, bolstered by the secure foundations of Elizabeth's religious peace. The prosperity of London's merchants, Oxford's scholars, and Exeter's clothiers all traced their origins to a queen who preferred negotiation over persecution. By the mid-16th century's close, England's religious life had settled into a stable pattern lasting more than half a century. The Church of England, once an experiment born of necessity, had matured into a resilient institution, able to weather occasional outbreaks of Puritan zeal or Catholic intrigue. Parish registers brimmed with births, marriages, and funerals conducted under Anglican rites. Universities flourished with debate societies and printing presses that churned out theological treatises and atlases alike. Elizabeth's moderate settlement contrasted sharply with Mary's purges. Whereas Mary's legacy was smoke and charcoal, Elizabeth's was parchment scrolls and sailing ships. Markets thrived, literacy spread, and the once fractured populace found unifying rituals that neither crushed conscience nor bred complacency. In the grand sweep of European religious history, Elizabeth's middle way marked a turning point. Continental powers observed as England, once torn apart by doctrinal flames, settled into a durable peace that stimulated both spiritual devotion and worldly enterprise. Protestant states in northern Europe envied England's stability. Catholic monarchs grudgingly acknowledged its prosperity. The Act of Uniformity, now revised and reissued in subtle updates, stood as proof that an established church could command loyalty without resorting to terror. Under Elizabeth's guidance, England transformed from a realm at the mercy of religious extremes into a kingdom that balanced faith and pragmatism, governance and grace. Thus, the era following Mary Tudor's death and Elizabeth I's swift reforms stands as a testament to the power of moderation. By repealing oppressive laws, enshrining a uniform prayer book, and extending measured tolerance to moderate Catholics, Elizabeth forged a path away from sectarian violence towards sustained cultural and economic growth. Her deft handling of assassination plots, secret masses, and shifting alliances underscored a reign defined by balance rather than brutality. As Shakespeare penned his iambic lines and explorers charted new worlds, England under Elizabeth discovered that harmony, rare and fragile, as it may be, unlocks opportunities far beyond the reach of fear. And so, the Church of England emerged not simply as a state mechanism, but as a shared faith that held together a nation once sundered by flames, setting the stage for 2 centuries of relative religious peace and a golden age of English enterprise. The religious legacy that followed Mary Tudor rippled across centuries, embedding itself in both sacred texts and popular culture alike. In the Geneva Bible and Reformation histories, the so-called Marian martyrs, Thomas Cranmer, Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer, and over 280 others are portrayed as paragons of defiance against divine tyranny. These men and women did not merely perish, they became towering figures of fortitude, raising their voices in unshakable faith even as the flames encircled them. Their ordeals were preserved in pulpit sermons and Protestant catechisms, and later transformed into stage dramas and even 19th century illustrated storybooks for children. Every retelling emphasized how each martyr wrestled with the fire, embodying the struggle to preserve one's conscience against authoritarian suppression. In stark contrast to the tragic aura surrounding Mary, Elizabeth I emerged as the idealized Virgin Queen, proud, just, and astutely diplomatic. Poets lauded her as an emblem of merciful sovereignty. Painters immortalized her in regal finery, radiating benevolence, and Victorian novelists recast her reign as a golden age of prudence and peace. In the centuries that followed, Elizabeth became the touchstone for a kind of tolerant womanhood, a counterpoint to her sister's impetuous zeal. The 2 sisters' divergent paths, Mary the fanatic and Elizabeth the pragmatic fuel, countless stage plays, television dramas, and historical novels, all dramatizing the eternal conflict between fervent faith and cool reason. On the theological front, Mary's story became a staple in Protestant preaching, an unsettling case study in the perils of extremism. Ministers quoted vivid details of her agonizing final days, her swollen belly, jaundiced flesh, and the necrosis that turned her into a macabre spectacle, to caution congregations against overzealous defense of doctrine. "Let her fate be your guide," they would intone, urging believers to temper conviction with charity. Yet in modern times, some Catholic scholars have sought to rehabilitate Mary's image, portraying her instead as a tragic figure of paternal manipulation and emotional neglect. They highlight her forced estrangement in childhood, her branding as illegitimate, and the psychological scars these inflicted, arguing that she deserves empathy as much as condemnation. Politically, Mary remains the archetype of absolutism gone awry, a sovereign who wielded religion as a cudgel, only to see her kingdom further fractured. Contemporary political theorists frequently cite her reign as evidence that faith, however sincere, cannot be imposed by decree. Instead, they argue, belief must grow voluntarily, in an environment of open debate and personal choice. This conclusion significantly influenced the later European doctrine of separating church and state. Enlightenment thinkers pointed to Mary's pyres as proof that conflating temporal power with spiritual authority leads to tyranny rather than unity. By the 18th century, the very notion of a state religion enforced through punishment seemed incompatible with the nascent ideas of democratic freedom. Even in popular culture, Mary's legacy endures as a vivid lesson in hubris and horror. Ghost stories of Bloody Mary chanting her name in a mirror continue to terrify children at slumber parties, while history podcasts dissect the anatomical realities of her fatal cancer, blending pathology with the macabre. Art exhibitions on Tudor England juxtapose glowing Elizabethan portraits with dark, charred fragments from Marian execution sites, reminding viewers that the same blood that fueled Mary's bonfires ultimately stained her own wretched demise. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's model of limited repression, followed by generous clemency, set a template for later monarchs and republics alike. Her via media, between Protestant fervour and Catholic heritage, helped stabilise England for decades, proving that compromise, when thoughtfully applied, can yield political and religious harmony. Scholars credit her early acts of uniformity and her judicious handling of conspiracy trials with saving the realm from the civil wars that tore apart France and the Holy Roman Empire. In doing so, Elizabeth laid intellectual groundwork for modern constitutional systems, where freedom of conscience is protected by law rather than quashed by edict. Today's historians and theologians continue to debate Mary's culpability and Elizabeth's sagacity, yet both women shape our understanding of power, belief, and human frailty. Their intertwined stories, one of fire and fanaticism, the other of restraint and renaissance, remind us that the relationship between church and state must be handled with utmost care. Too often, zeal without empathy becomes cruelty. Too often, authority unchecked breeds tragedy. From the ashes of Mary's bonfires rose the phoenix of Elizabethan tolerance, proving that the sharpest flames can yield the gentlest light, but only when they burn away the dross of extremism, leaving behind the enduring warmth of shared humanity. In the annals of medical history, few case files are as haunting or as invaluable as the detailed records of Queen Mary Tudor's final illness. Imagine candlelight flickering over cramped manuscripts as court physicians scrawled notes by lamplight. Descriptions of her expanding abdomen, the excruciating cramps that racked her belly, the jaundiced yellow taint creeping across her once fair skin, and the festering ulcers that refused to heal. These observations, preserved in diplomatic dispatches, physician correspondence, and palace journals, read like a grisly fever dream, yet they form a rare archive of pre-modern pathology. It would not be until the 19th and 20th centuries, with the advent of cellular pathology and the newfound understanding of ovarian and hepatic malignancies, that scholars could piece together these early descriptions into a coherent cancer diagnosis. British medical conferences began displaying these Tudor-era documents under the banner of ancient medical treasures, shining a spotlight on the epidemiology of medieval tumorous disease. From a purely clinical standpoint, Mary's case offers a running chronicle of late-stage malignancy, long before most clinicians grasped what cancer truly entailed. Her court physicians, armed only with lancets, purgative herbs, and blazing cauteries, sought to rebalance her humours, but only intensified her suffering. Chroniclers recorded bouts of vertigo, delirium, and profound weakness, all signs of systemic decline. Her jaundice signalled hepatic involvement, her distended belly, likely ovarian ascites. The documented progression, umbilical protrusion, skin lesions, weeping dark fluid, organ failure mirrors modern case studies in gynecologic oncology. Thus, Mary's personal tragedy inadvertently bequeathed a vital teaching tool, bridging the gap between pre-modern superstition and the sterile rigour of modern histology. Universities from Oxford to Edinburgh count Mary Tudor's case among their prized teaching specimens. Albeit in a literary sense, she remains the queen whose suffering illustrated the natural history of abdominal malignancy centuries before the microscope would reveal malignant cells. But the real legacy extends beyond the charts and charts. Mary's ordeal shed light on the catastrophic shortcomings of Renaissance medicine, underscoring the urgent need for more humane, scientifically grounded approaches to terminal illness. In her day, every physician was a mix of physician and exorcist, convinced that demonic forces might underlie physical afflictions. Bloodletting to shocking degrees, emetic concoctions of hellebore and mercury, and caustic herbal potions were as likely to kill the patient as the disease itself. Mary's agonized wails, recorded in court diaries, testify to the folly of these brutal interventions. Posterity has judged these treatments harshly, and rightly so. Her suffering became a vivid exemplar, cited by Enlightenment reformers, calling for evidence-based medicine, patient consent, and limits on harmful cures. In the centuries that followed, Mary's death became a frequent case study in medical ethics symposia. Physicians pored over her notes to illustrate how not to treat advanced disease. They contrasted Mary's torments with the rising philosophy of do no harm, championed by 19th century physicians such as Sir William Osler. Mary's journals, once hidden in locked royal archives, found their way into medical libraries alongside Hippocrates and Galen, offering both cautionary tales and insights into the evolution of palliative care. Scholars in medical humanities explore her case to discuss the mind-body connection. Her physical agony drove her to religious mania, as hundreds of court letters attest, and her resulting paranoia only deepened the cycle of distress. Today's oncology departments sometimes invite historians to speak on the psychiatric dimensions of chronic illness, using Mary Tudor as an early example of how untreated pain and fear can warp perceptions and accelerate decline. Beyond the strictly medical, Mary's plight has fueled research in psychology and pastoral care. Therapists analyze her documented delusions, suspicions of poisoning, hallucinations of demonic assault as classic manifestations of delirium and extreme stress. They note how isolation exacerbated her terror. Stripped of companions by court intrigue, she faced her bodily collapse in near-total solitude. Modern end-of-life care models emphasize the opposite. Interdisciplinary teams of doctors, nurses, chaplains, and social workers, ensuring that the dying are neither physically neglected nor psychologically abandoned. Mary's diaries, reproduced in annotated editions, serve as a rallying cry for integrative palliative approaches treating the whole person, not just the tumor. Mary's case also resonates in philosophical circles. Bioethicists invoke her story to debate the morality of heroic medicine versus comfort care. Was it kinder to attempt a fatal purgative, or to ease her passage with analgesics, if available? In the absence of modern anesthetics, her screams might qualify as the earliest recorded accounts of iatrogenic suffering harm inflicted by treatment itself. Thus, Mary Tudor's tragedy transcends monarchy. It becomes the locus for enduring debates over medical prerogative, patient autonomy, and the limits of intervention. In popular culture, too, Mary's final chapter has a chilling allure. Documentaries reconstruct her last days with forensic artistry, while historical fiction delves into her psyche, blending recorded symptoms with imagined dialogues between queen and physician. Podcasts devoted entire episodes to Diagnosing Bloody Mary, complete with reenactments of Tudor apothecaries fumbling with leeches and lanterns. Even so, these retellings ring with a common theme: the indispensable role of compassion and science in confronting mortal disease. Looking back across centuries, Mary Tudor's case stands as both a medical monument and a cautionary tale. It reminds us that human authority, even a queen's, cannot bend the arc of nature. Her rotting flesh, her tortured mind, and her courtiers' helpless gazes all speak to a universal truth. The only true curative force is knowledge coupled with empathy. Power cannot shield us from biological fate. Only a synergy of scientific rigor and human kindness can light the dark corridor toward a dignified death. So, next time you hear a weary physician sigh over a stubborn cancer case, remember Mary Tudor. Her journals sit in archives, their spidery script attesting to the birth pangs of modern oncology and palliative thought. From royal decrees to bedside protocols, the echo of her agonies shaped centuries of medical progress. If that thought doesn't lull you into a contemplative slumber, nothing will except perhaps the gentle hum of a well-tended hospice ward, where science and compassion stand watch together against the ravages of disease. You know how some historical figures seem to fade away, buried under dusty textbooks? Well, not Bloody Mary. In popular culture, she's the ultimate Gothic anti-heroine, more chilling than any fictitious spectre. Picture her in a dimly lit castle corridor, skin stretched taut over sunken cheeks, open sores oozing dark ichor, and that blood-curdling scream echoing off the stone walls. Filmmakers and novelists have had a field day with her. In Hammer horror style flicks of the 1970s and 80s, titles like Mary's Curse reimagined her as the unholy avenger of England's Protestants, stalking candlelit halls in tattered crimson robes. Each frame dripped with dread, the camera lingering on her trembling hand as she lit a torch to relight the flames of persecution. And the legend of the mirror ritual: stand before a tarnished looking-glass, chant her name thrice, and summon her ghost, sprang directly from these cultural retellings, a twisted bedtime challenge that still terrifies sleepover crowds. But screen and page weren't the end of Bloody Mary's reach. Rock and metal bands have borrowed her moniker to evoke brutality and chaos. From early 80s punk groups railing against religious hypocrisy to modern death metal acts hammering out riffs as savage as Tudor crossbows, Mary's name sells records. Even Lady Gaga got in on the act. Her 2011 pop synth track, Bloody Mary, casts Mary Tudor as a darkly glamorous queen, draped in velvet shadows and mournful melodies. Gaga's chorus: "If you choose to run away with me, I'll tickle you internally," twists Mary's story into a vampiric dance of power and pain, inviting young audiences to glimpse Tudor tragedy through club lights and echoing beats. That blend of melancholy chords and dramatic lyrics has inspired countless remixes and TikTok challenges, bridging Elizabethan lore and 21st century pop culture. Literature, too, swallows Mary whole. Jean Plady's historical novel Mary Tudor paints her in sympathetic tones her cruelty, a symptom of childhood exile and fatherly betrayal. In contrast, fantasy works like The Mirror of Mary twist her into a literal mirror demon, punishing traitors in shadow realms. Contemporary novelists strive for nuanced portraits. A woman torn between memories of the Pearl of England and the embers of vengeance she lit herself. They explore her lonely nostalgia for a distant mother, her simmering resentments toward Henry VIII, and that obsessive hunger to reclaim an ancestral faith. These stories juggle empathy and horror, tracing her psyche as tender yet twisted, haunted by guilt, driven by fanaticism, and ultimately consumed by both. In each novel's final chapter, readers close the cover with a shiver, asking themselves which was more monstrous, Mary's actions or her ruthless ambition. So, Mary Tudor has escaped the dusty annals of history to become a chameleon of popular culture. To some, she's a medical mystery, an early case study in cancer's cruelty. To others, a fanatic whose bonfires backfired on her own soul. Still to others, a restless spirit haunting mortals who dare to mock their own mortality. Blood-soaked pulp novels and high art galleries alike draw from her legend, asking the same haunting questions. What is justice when wielded by terror? Can compassion ever temper unyielding faith? And how does power shape and sometimes warp the human heart? Even as you drift off tonight, perhaps you'll catch a glimpse of her in the mirror, a pale smile on cracked lips, reminding you that the line between persecutor and victim can blur, and that history's darkest flame can burn within us all. And so our journey through the life and legacy of Mary Tudor, known to history as Bloody Mary, comes to an end. Through today's video, you have gained a comprehensive perspective on a queen who challenged both religion and medicine, and, above all, the enduring lesson about the value of balancing faith, power, and compassion. First, we saw how religious fanaticism, when unchecked by reason and mercy, can become a tool that destroys both ideals and human lives. Mary burned hundreds to save souls, only for those very flames to consume her from within. This stands as a powerful warning. No matter how righteous an ideology may seem, it can slip into brutal extremism without tolerance. Second, the film and medical stories surrounding Mary's symptoms underscored the importance of humane medicine. Medieval treatments, bloodletting, and powerful purges did nothing but intensify suffering. In our modern world, despite scientific advances, we must remember that every patient facing a terminal illness needs holistic care. Physical therapies paired with psychological support to prevent isolation and despair. This is the spirit of palliative care you can apply when a loved one battles a severe disease, offering not just drugs, but warmth and empathy. Third, the tale of sisters Mary and Elizabeth offers a lesson in wise leadership and politics. In her despair, Mary chose the incendiary path of destruction. Elizabeth, with calm deliberation, wove a tapestry of diplomacy and tolerance. Today, even if you never hold office, you can apply the principle of the via media, the middle way, when negotiating or resolving conflicts. Find common ground first, then gradually narrow differences, instead of plunging headlong into confrontation. Finally, Bloody Mary lives on in popular culture as an icon. Mirror-chanting rituals, rock music, Gothic novels, and speculative fiction all remind us that history is more than dry dates. It is a series of intense, deeply human experiences. When you rewatch this video, remember you are not merely absorbing facts, you are touching vivid stories that have left their mark on countless generations. The core messages you can take into your modern life are: harness passion with reason. Even the noblest convictions require reflection, heeding the voice of conscience and empathy. The power of tolerance. A small concession today can preserve broad peace, avoiding needless conflict. Holistic care. Under any circumstance, people need both physical healing and emotional support. Lead with gentle firmness. Authority is most enduring when built on trust and openness rather than harshness. I hope that when you turn off the screen, you carry Mary Tudor's story as a lasting reminder. History waits for no one, and lessons from the past only gain meaning when we face them honestly and apply that wisdom to our present actions. Thank you for joining me. If you found this video helpful, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me what you learned today.